Hey there, Nightmare Seekers. Welcome to Mr. Nightmarely, where we dive deep into the darkest corners of the unknown, sharing spine-chilling true stories and experiences that will keep you up at night. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up if you're ready for the terror ahead, and don't forget to drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, because we love hearing from our global community of thrill seekers. Now, settle in, and let's get ready to explore the darkest and most unsettling stories from real-life horror. It begins innocently enough. The perfect hike through California's rugged mountains. Just me and the wilds. My friend had canceled last minute, so I decided to take the hike alone. It was supposed to be a simple day trip, a few hours, maybe 5 or 6, in the deep silence of nature. I thought I'd found peace. The sun was shining through the trees, the birds sang, and the wind rustled the leaves as I began down the trail. I felt a sense of freedom, of solitude, but there was something off, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. The trail was supposed to be well marked, but it was eerily quiet. No one else was around. I stopped to check the map. A quick glance confirmed I was on the right path, but as I moved on, I noticed the air felt thicker. The temperature dropped a few degrees. The bird stopped singing. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a change in weather. But something in the forest was different. I swear, the shadows between the trees seemed darker than they should have been. I was a few miles in when the trail forked. The signs were old, half faded and weather-worn. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I took the right path, the one less traveled. It was more overgrown, and the brush scraped against my legs as I pushed forward. The further I went, the more the trail began to fade into the woods. The trees seemed to grow taller, their twisted limbs stretching like fingers toward the sky. It felt like something was watching me, but I couldn't pinpoint it. The unsettling silence grew louder. I checked the time, only 2 hours in, but it felt like something was pulling me deeper. I stumbled upon a strange sight, a campfire ring, half buried and abandoned, but it looked freshly used. There were charred remnants of what seemed like food scraps. I glanced around. No footprints. Nothing. Just an empty camp. That's when I felt it. A cold gust of wind brushed the back of my neck. Someone was close. But I was completely alone. I checked the trail signs again. I'd gone too far. The trail I thought I was on was now lost. Something wasn't right, and I had no idea how to get back. The feeling of being watched intensified. I quickened my pace, trying to push through the trees. The ground was uneven and treacherous, and I had to keep my eyes on my footing. That's when I heard it, a voice. Soft at first, almost like a whisper. It wasn't in English, not that I could tell, but I knew it wasn't just the wind. Someone was nearby. I turned around, scanning the woods behind me. Nothing. No one. Just the thick woods and the eerie stillness. I pressed on, but the voice kept calling. It sounded like it was getting closer. Panicking, I broke into a sprint. The trees seemed to close in, their shadows stretching, turning into figures. I swear, the faces in the bark changed as I passed, but I couldn't focus on them. I was breathing hard now, my chest tightening, but I couldn't stop. I stumbled into a small clearing and froze. The voice stopped, but there was something else there, a figure, barely visible through the brush. It was tall, wearing a hooded cloak, and it was completely still. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, the figure turned its head, and its eyes, if you could call them that, stared straight at me. They were empty, dark voids. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at me. That's when I bolted. I don't know how much time passed. My legs burned from running, but I couldn't stop. The trees blurred around me as I sprinted, heart pounding, the sound of my breath the only thing keeping me grounded. That's when I saw it, the trail sign I had passed hours ago. I was nearly back, but everything had changed. The sky had darkened, and the trail was now twisted, as though the woods themselves were shifting. I heard the voice again, closer now, behind me. I turned to face whatever was following me, but the figure was gone. Only the thick fog remained. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot. That's when I felt something cold grab my ankle. It was a hand, icy like stone, and it pulled me down. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the grip tightened, my vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw the face of something terrible, its empty eyes watching me. And then nothing. The fog cleared. The forest was still. The figure was gone. But I wasn't safe. I knew that for certain. The trail had changed. It wasn't just me anymore. Something had followed me out, and it wasn't letting me go. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend escape. Just me, the open trail, and the majestic landscape of California's Sequoia National Park. I had heard stories, of course. Everyone has, whispers of hikers who'd gone off the path, never to return. But those were just stories, right? Ghost tales to scare the tourists. I never imagined I'd become part of one. The air felt crisp as I set out at dawn, a thin veil of fog still clinging to the earth. The towering pine trees loomed overhead, their needles rustling gently in the wind. The path was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual bird calls and the hum of distant wildlife were absent. It wasn't uncommon in the mornings. Animals were often still tucked away in their dens. But something about this silence felt unnatural. I pushed the thought away, adjusting my backpack as I walked deeper into the woods. I'd been on this trail before, years ago, and it had been nothing but serene. This time, though, the forest seemed different. The trees weren't just tall. They felt ancient, as if they had been standing guard for centuries, watching over the land with an eerie patience. As I made my way through the dense grove, the sun began to rise higher, casting long shadows across the path. It was when I reached the edge of the first clearing that I noticed something strange. The ground was covered with an odd pattern of disturbed earth, like something or someone had been there recently. The trail seemed to vanish into the forest, as though the ground had swallowed it whole. I froze. Something didn't feel right. I knelt down, running my fingers over the disturbed dirt. There were large, uneven footprints, too large for an average person, but not deep enough to be from a bear or any other animal I could think of. They were human-shaped. My stomach churned. It wasn't uncommon to encounter other hikers, but I hadn't passed anyone for hours, and the nearest campsite was still miles away. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood, brushing the dirt from my knees, and continued on, telling myself it was nothing, just another weird quirk of nature. But deep down, I knew something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The further I went, the more I noticed the strange behavior of the forest around me. The air grew colder, and the silence intensified. Even the trees seemed to shift subtly, like they were growing closer, leaning toward me. Every step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness. I came upon another strange scene. The trail ahead seemed to simply disappear, the path swallowed up by dense underbrush. The map in my hand showed a well-maintained trail that should have continued through the trees, but all I saw was thick foliage and a sense of overwhelming darkness. The pines here were different, more twisted, their trunks gnarled and bent at odd angles. I hesitated. The choice was clear: turn back and retrace my steps, or push forward and try to find where the trail had gone. I chose to move ahead, thinking I could find another way. But as I did, the deeper I ventured into the underbrush, the more the world around me seemed to shift. The trees seemed to close in tighter, and the dense silence was oppressive. That's when I first heard it, a low whisper, faint at first like the rustle of the wind or my own imagination playing tricks. But then it came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, low and guttural, but undeniably there. I stopped in my tracks, heart hammering. The sound wasn't in front of me. It was behind me, from the depths of the trees, as if something was trying to communicate with me. I turned around, but there was nothing. Just the endless pines, casting shadows that seemed to stretch longer with every passing moment. I swallowed hard and took another step, moving forward despite the creeping dread that now clung to me. I had to get out. I couldn't explain why, but I just knew that the longer I stayed, the more dangerous it would become. As I pressed forward, the whispering continued, faint but persistent. I thought I was just hearing things, but the air grew heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. And then I saw it, a figure, standing motionless among the trees. At first, I thought it was another hiker, a person I hadn't noticed before, standing perfectly still in the shadows. But as I drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure was too still. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It was as though it wasn't a person at all, but something else. Something wrong. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, clad in dark, tattered clothing, its face hidden in the deep shadows of the hood. It didn't make a sound, didn't shift its weight. It simply watched me with a chilling stillness. I stopped dead in my tracks, my mouth dry. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response, no movement, nothing. I took a hesitant step forward. "Are you lost?" Still no answer. And then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, the figure slowly lifted its hand, pointing toward me. A sharp chill ran down my spine. I froze. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the outstretched hand. Before I could react, the figure disappeared, vanishing into the trees like it had never been there at all. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Was I seeing things? Or was there something else in the woods with me? I took another step backward, but the whispering returned. This time, it was louder, more urgent. It was coming from all around me, as though the trees themselves were speaking. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. The whispers were growing louder, echoing around me in a maddening chorus. They were no longer distant, they were close. I could almost feel the breath of whatever was lurking in the woods. I glanced around, but all I could see were the endless trees, their shadows stretching longer with each passing second. The path had disappeared entirely now. There was no way back. I was lost. That's when the ground beneath me shifted. I staggered, almost falling, and when I looked down, I saw it, a deep, jagged crack in the earth, like the forest itself had opened up to swallow me whole. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the ground seemed to pulse, as though something beneath was moving. I felt something brush against my ankle, a cold, clammy touch that made me gasp. I looked down, but nothing was there. But then I heard it, footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate. Someone or something was following me. I spun around, but I couldn't see anyone. Only the dark, oppressive forest that had turned from peaceful to malevolent. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then, suddenly, the whispering stopped. The forest went deathly quiet. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I turned and ran. I've been planning this solo hike for weeks. The weather was perfect, the timing was right, and I had all the supplies I needed, everything I thought I'd need. But there was one thing I didn't account for: the map. It was a rare trail I had stumbled upon, and the guidebook said very little about it. Just a small section of a larger, well-known park in the Sierra Nevada. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the Hidden Trail, though nobody ever seemed to really talk about why. At first, I thought it was just the usual small-town mystique, a trail that was off the beaten path for those looking for something more wild, more secluded. I was drawn to the idea of being alone, far from the crowds, and the Hidden Trail seemed perfect for that. I found a vague reference to it in a worn-out local map that I picked up from a small, weathered shop at the edge of town. The shopkeeper had been strangely quiet when I asked about the trail, simply nodding and handing me the map without a word. The map was torn in places, stained with time, but it marked the trail clearly enough. It showed a small loop that veered off from the main path, barely noticeable, a mere line in the farthest corner. It wasn't supposed to be anything too dangerous. The description was brief, almost cryptic. Follow the winding path. The trees know the way. I shrugged it off. It sounded like something right out of a horror novel. But the allure of adventure drew me in. At the trailhead, the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of aroma that feels so clean you can almost taste it. I should have felt excited, but instead, the hairs on the back of my neck tingled. I dismissed it as first-day nerves. As I started walking, the familiar sounds of the forest welcomed me. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the wind, and the distant trickle of a stream was soothing. But after about an hour of walking, I realized something strange. The sounds had changed. The forest had grown unnaturally silent. I paused, scanning my surroundings. Everything felt too still. The trees, too close. seemed to stretch higher than normal, their branches twisting into unnatural angles. I looked at the map again. The line I was following seemed to wind more tightly now. I'd followed the trail off the main path, but somehow it didn't feel like I was on a trail at all. The landscape around me was unfamiliar. The trees appeared thicker and the shadows darker. I brushed it off, convinced that it was just my nerves playing tricks. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being led somewhere that had been waiting for me. Hours passed as I ventured deeper into the trail. By now, the landscape had completely changed. The trees towered above me like silent sentinels, their trunks wider, their bark more gnarled and twisted. The air was heavy with moisture, and the sunlight seemed to have a strange, muted quality. I couldn't shake the growing sensation that something was off, but I pressed on, telling myself it was just my overactive imagination. The further I walked, the more I realized how isolated I felt. I hadn't seen any other hikers all day. It was just me and the wilds now. Then came the whispers. At first I thought it was the wind. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches brushing against each other in the breeze. But soon enough, I could tell it was more than that. The whispers were different. They seemed deliberate, as if someone or something was speaking to me. I stopped dead in my tracks. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the low murmurs. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words, but they were just out of reach. They were too soft, too distant. Then, they grew louder. It wasn't just a single voice. It was a chorus, a dissonant, unsettling murmur that seemed to come from all around me. I turned in every direction, scanning the dense forest, but saw nothing. The trees were motionless, their bark almost black in the dim light, like sentinels standing guard over something hidden in the shadows. I felt the urge to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, caught between fear and the undeniable need to understand what was happening. It was as if the trees themselves were whispering secrets to one another, secrets that were meant for no one but the forest itself. "Don't listen," the wind seemed to say, though it was impossible to tell if the words were real or just my mind playing tricks. I stepped forward, each footfall echoing too loudly in the unnatural silence. But every time I moved, I felt the eyes of the forest on me. And, just as I was about to call out, the whispering stopped. Everything went completely silent. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my chest, and I suddenly wanted nothing more than to leave. But the trail ahead remained unchanged, silent, waiting, leading me deeper. As I walked further, the landscape continued to shift in ways I couldn't explain. It felt like the forest was alive, breathing around me, guiding me deeper into its heart. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. The whispers had returned, but this time, they weren't just distant murmurs. They were clear, forming actual words. Words that made my blood run cold. "Turn back now." I stumbled to a stop. I couldn't believe what I had heard. The voice, if it could even be called a voice, was raspy, almost like the wind itself had turned into something darker. But I couldn't dismiss it. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I stood frozen in place, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. I glanced behind me, but all I saw was the thick forest stretching into the shadows. There was no sign of another person, nothing to explain what I was feeling. "Turn back." The words echoed in my mind as I stood there, torn between turning around and continuing forward. My body was exhausted, and the hike was proving more difficult than I had anticipated. I glanced at the map again, and that's when I saw it. The line on the map had begun to blur. It no longer matched the landscape around me. In fact, it wasn't even the same trail. The path I was following now didn't exist on the map at all. The trees around me seemed to close in, and I had the unmistakable feeling that the trail itself was shifting, morphing before my eyes. That's when I heard it. A figure stepped out from between the trees, tall, cloaked in shadows, with an almost skeletal appearance. I could barely make out its features, but the way it moved, unnaturally slow and deliberate, sent a wave of dread crashing through me. The thing wasn't human. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My legs were frozen in place, as if the forest itself was holding me captive. The figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, and I felt like I was being pulled into their depths. I don't remember much after that. All I remember is the overwhelming urge to run, to escape. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. The forest around me seemed to stretch on endlessly, its trees closing in on me, pushing me farther into its grasp. I can't say what happened next, whether I blacked out or if the forest simply swallowed me whole. But when I came to, I was at the edge of the forest. The trail was gone. The whispers had stopped. I was no longer on the hidden trail. I was standing at the edge of the wilderness, staring at the familiar path I had started on, as though I had never even ventured off it. But the memory of that figure, those whispers, still haunts me. I've been back to that area since, but I've never found the trail again. It's like it never existed. And yet, every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. Don't go back. It knows you now.